State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to this, our first event in our fall lecture series on the 2020 election. Between now and Election Day, we're going to have weekly events that will feature leading political scholars from across the country talking about different aspects of the campaign and the election. I want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences at WSU for their support of this series and their continued support of the Foley Institute. All of these events will be live streamed on our YouTube channel. They'll also be available there afterwards as taped versions that you can watch at any time at your convenience. If you want more information about our lecture series, I encourage you to go to our website at foley.wsu.edu, or you can simply email us at tsfoley@wsu.edu and we'll send you information. So to start off our election series, we thought there was no better topic than partisan polarization. Americans' political attitudes have become increasingly more partisan over the last 30 to 40 years. Democrats and Republicans alike have become more likely to support their own party's candidates, adopt their own party's issue positions, and distort their perceptions of objective facts in order to fit their party's preferred versions of reality. Even more ominous, however, is the growing level of affective polarization built around our increasingly divergent social identities. Americans no longer see themselves as engaged in a common social endeavor and increasingly view those from the other party with distrust, loathing, and as existential threats to the nation's survival and very well-being. Many of us refuse to socialize across partisan lines. We no longer want our children to marry anyone belonging to the other party. And there's growing evidence that voters are today motivated more by negative partisanship, that is, a desire to defeat and humiliate the other side, rather than out of any affirmative desire to affect their party's policies and priorities. What is happening to the United States? What is the cause of this growing level of partisan polarization and negative partisanship? And how will it shape the 2020 election? So fortunately, we have the perfect guest to kick off our 2020 election series. Lilliana Mason is an associate professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland at College Park. She is the author of Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity, published by the University of Chicago Press. Her research focuses on American partisanship, partisan bias, social sorting, and polarization. In light of recent events, such as the violence breaking out during protests over race and policing, or the armed protests over government shutdown orders, I've asked Lily to speak about some of her most recent research into what she calls partisan hostility. What makes some people inclined to engage in aggressive political behavior and even political violence? Dr. Mason is currently working on a new book with Nathan Calmo, due to be out next year, titled Radical American Partisanship: Mapping Extreme Hostility, Its Causes and Its Consequences for Democracy. Let me just also add that Lily was a past guest of the Foley Institute, so I really appreciate her coming on again and kicking off our 2020 election series. So Dr. Mason is going to speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, after which we will have some time for discussion. So I encourage you, if you have questions you'd like to ask Dr. Mason, to send those to me via email at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, that's tsfoley@wsu.edu. So Lily, I am now going to turn the time over to you, and I'll be back after you're finished with some questions from our audience.
Great, thank you so much. I want to thank Cornell and the whole Foley Institute for this invitation. I am honored to be at the beginning of a very interesting and distinguished list of scholars who are studying American politics right now. So I'm hoping that I can be the right kind of kickoff for this really impressive series. Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm just going to share my screen. So this is basically, the way this talk is going to go is that I'm going to start off with some of my information from my first book, Uncivil Agreement, to explain sort of how the current state of polarization came to be. And then I'm going to bring in some new material from this book that I'm working on with Nathan Calmo, about sort of the extremes of where partisanship can go and where it actually already is in American politics. So I'm going to start off by just laying some basic groundwork. This is data from the American National Election Studies in 2016, looking at what I call policy-based polarization. So the extent to which Americans disagree with one another about actual policies and issues. I took the average of the sort of major 6 issues that they always ask about, or that were most salient in that year. And I, made an index that ranged from 0 was the most liberal to 1 is the most conservative. This is the figure on the left. And basically, what I found was that most people, even Republicans, are scoring a 0.39. They're not even at 0.5. So even Republicans actually have sort of left-leaning policy preferences on average. Democrats have more left-leaning policy preferences, but this certainly isn't a picture of people who have nothing in common and can't possibly agree on anything. On the right, I tried measuring it a different way, because maybe taking the mean of all those issue positions is not the right way to measure it. So I measured it just saying, what is the percent of those questions that the person is on the correct side of, right? So it's a Republican on the conservative side of the question, of the answer. And again, I found that Republicans were on the correct side, the conservative side of the issue, about 39% of the time, and Democrats were about 44% of the time. So not even half of the time for either Republicans or Democrats. So basically, this paints a picture of an electorate that has plenty in common, that should have plenty of room to compromise, that should be reaching across the aisle and working hard to make sure everybody's lives are better. But from the exact same survey, the exact same people, if you ask people about their feelings towards their own party and the other party, these are called feeling thermometers, you see a very divided electorate where on the left, Democrats, they feel about 27 degrees of warmth towards Republicans. That's quite cold. And they feel 75 degrees of warmth towards their own party. Republicans are the mirror image. So this is not a picture of a country that has plenty of room to compromise and has a lot in common. This is a picture of a country that is quite divided. So why is there this difference? And this is really where my work in uncivil agreement started, was to say, how do we explain this difference? And the way that I have found the most useful is to go to social identity theory, which was developed in the 1970s by Henri Tajfel. And basically, the way that they demonstrated the principles of social identity theory is through an experiment they called the minimal group paradigm experiment. That sounds very complicated, but it's not. So basically, imagine that you're looking at this screen full of dots. You're all alone in a room. Maybe you don't have to imagine. And a researcher asks you to estimate the number of dots on the screen. So you estimate them, you tell the researcher the number, and they inform you that you are either an overestimator or an underestimator. You're then asked to do a bunch of other tasks. And then they say, oh, there's one more thing we want to do. We have this money allocation task we want to do. We're just going to use the overestimator, underestimator labels just for convenience. Don't worry about it. And so the way that the experiment, that's very bright. The way the experiment is set up is that respondents are allowed to choose between 2 basic conditions. This is oversimplification, but this is basically the gist of it. Either everyone, overestimators and underestimators, all get $5. Or let's say overestimators, your own group, gets 4, but the out group gets 3. So effectively, that is asking people who just found out they're a member of this group that they didn't know they were a part of. They're never going to meet another person that's in the group, and they have no interest in ever finding other people in the group. Either they can get $5 for everyone and have this greater good, or they can sacrifice that money for victory, right? For the sense of winning. Tajfel expected that everyone would choose the greater good in this scenario, and then he was going to build in conditions to make it, to find, what conditions does it take to find group bias. But in fact, over and over, with a lot of different names, besides over and underestimators, he kept finding that people were choosing the in-group win condition. So there is something about the human psyche that wishes for victory, right? Once you know that you're part of a group, it feels important for you individually for that group to have status. The group status informs your own sense of self-worth and your own sense of status in society. And so as long as your group has status, that feels good, and therefore we're willing to sacrifice for that feeling. So our instincts are pushing us away from finding the greater good solution. Now, this is just for these minimal groups, right? These completely meaningless groups. Partisanship is obviously a much stronger group identity. It's constantly the status of our party is constantly being threatened every time there's an election or every time there's a piece of legislation even. And Trump himself in the 2016 campaign really focused on this word win. This concept of victory, right? He really doubled down on the idea that you're gonna be willing to sacrifice things in order, if I give you this sense of victory, right? You may not be feeling great about yourself right now, but I'm gonna make you feel like a winner because you're gonna win this time. And that allows people to sacrifice a lot because they often need that sense of status, of social status. So that was party identity. We obviously all have hundreds of social identities. We belong to many, many different groups, some of which we don't even think about until somebody threatens them, right? Like I'm a member of my hometown. I don't think about it unless someone says everyone from my hometown is dumb. So we have all these identities. We have an ideological identity. We feel attached to the label liberal or conservative. We have racial identities. We have religious identities. If these identities are not all linked together, right? If they're not really strongly correlated with each other, if your party loses an election or any status contest, then that portion of your self-worth and your self-concept might be damaged, but these other identities are there, kind of keeping you afloat, right? You still have a sense of status from these other identities that are unconnected to that party loss. However, if they are overlapping, then when your party loses, it almost infects these other identities. So the party loss doesn't just hurt in terms of your partisan identity, but it hurts in terms of all of these other identities that make up your self-concept and your self-worth. So if these other identities become aligned with party, the party loss is not just the party loss. It's all of the status of all of these groups together are losing. And that makes elections and electoral outcomes much more dire. Just as a quick explanation, this is the 1972 American National Election Studies data. And basically, for each of these groups on the left, I said, you know, what's the percentage of Republicans in that group and what's the percentage of Democrats? And I subtracted the percentage of Democrats from the percentage of Republicans. So the red lines that are positive are more Republicans in the group. The blue lines that are negative are more Democrats in the group. And the length of the line is how divided that group is, right? How many more Democrats or how many more Republicans and Democrats or vice versa. So basically what we see in 1972 is that there's a small gender gap. Men are slightly more Republican. Conservatives are much more Republican, obviously. Liberals are more Democratic. Importantly, church attenders have no party difference at all. This is essentially a cross-cutting identity in 1972, where the people who go to church are a perfect mixture of Democrats and Republicans. Southerners were Democratic in 1972, if we remember our history. Wealthy people were more Republican, white people were more Republican, Black people were more Democratic, Catholic people were more Democratic, Protestants, Republican, Union Democratic. This is kind of the classic divide that we think about, right? And we don't expect our parties to be exactly the same on every single possible social demographic, right? We expect them to be different in some ways. And that's what we see in 1972. And we think of this as like the classic social divide between Democrats and Republicans. But the important thing is that they're not entirely divided on these demographic things and these social identities. And so in 2016, what we see is this really big increase in the divide within groups between Democrats and Republicans. So there are far more Republicans among people who call themselves conservative, far more Republicans than Democrats. Among people who call themselves liberals, far more Democrats than Republicans. Church attendance is now Republican. Southern is now Republican, income percentile, Republican. White is much more Republican than it was in 1972. Black is much more Democratic than it was in 1972. Catholic and Protestant are Republican. So, and Union is still Democratic. So you'll note that we have this new, even bigger divide that is partially ideology, that is increasingly racial, and that is also increasingly religious versus non-religious instead of Catholic versus Protestant. And so instead of having lots of little differences, we have basically a few really, really extremely large differences between the two parties that effectively mean that the parties are divided along these kind of crucial social identities. So what is the sort of emotional effect of this type of sorting on an individual level? So what I did is I went back to the 1992 American National Election Studies panel that re-interviewed the same people in 1996. And this was the time when party ID was kind of in flux. So it's a good time to be measuring change. And what I did was I just looked at people who either their party and their ideological identities had become closer, more aligned, which is sorted. This is, I'll go to the gray bar. Or people whose partisan and ideological identities stay the same, or people whose party and ideological identities diverged, got even further apart. And then I looked at the change in their self-reported anger between 1992 and 1996. One thing you'll notice here is that everyone got more angry between 1992 and 1996. That's likely because 1994 was in the middle, where there was this revolutionary House election. Newt Gingrich took over as Speaker and immediately shut down the government in 1995. So there's a lot more anger. But the people who grew the angriest were the people whose identities were in alignment. And the people who grew angrier the least are the people who had these conflicting, or what we call cross-cutting identities, or increasingly cross-cutting. Now, interestingly, during the same period of time, sorting has no effect on people's issue intensity. The issue intensity is not changing during this period of time, regardless of level of sorting. The issue intensity is just basically staying exactly the same, but anger is increasing, right? So our emotions and our responses to politics are increasing, but our issue positions are not necessarily changing all that much. Okay, so that's the uncivil agreement part of this talk. And now I'm going to move into something that is, I think, slightly more worrisome, which is work I'm doing with Nathan Calmo on the limits of partisanship. How far can we take our understanding of American mass partisanship? And this is in the context of, as we all know, an increasing level of political violence. We have think tanks telling us that it's time to set up a domestic atrocity prevention program. The Southern Poverty Law Center is tracing a large number of, an increasing number of hate groups. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a sort of centrist think tank, actually generated this graph on the bottom left where they see this really massive rise of right-wing terrorist attacks and plots since 2013. And in fact, in that report, which is a June 2020 report, in that report, they warn that the biggest concern is the US 2020 presidential election, where they believe that before and after the election, but especially after, extremists are going to resort to violence, depending on the outcome. And this is in June, they say far right and far left networks have used violence against each other at protests, raising the possibility of escalating violence during the election period. This is even more salient today when we're watching what's happening in Kenosha. This is something that it's not imaginary. It's going to happen. It's going to keep happening. So it's time for us to really pay attention to what we know about the sort of partisan side, the partisanship that is driving this type of behavior. So to begin, this is one of the main arguments, just to set up the theory, is that the way that we understood American political behavior, the way that we still understand American political behavior, is based on this foundational work, The American Voter, which was published in 1960, but it was written using data from the 1950s when Eisenhower was either president or up for election. This was an extremely nonpartisan time. Eisenhower didn't even know which party he was going to run for president under. And so we created the foundations of our theories about partisanship in a very, very peaceful period. And so our ideas about how far partisanship can go in American politics are somewhat limited due to the fact that our theories weren't created with this sort of contemporary environment in mind. And in fact, what I'm going to demonstrate is that, in fact, ordinary partisanship can turn radical, can become radical, or can be expressed in extremely radical ways. We just haven't been measuring them that way. And some of the affective polarization literature has sort of inched towards that by doing these feeling thermometers, by asking, how would you feel if a member of your family married an outgroup partisan, or would you live next door to an outgroup partisan? But these are sort of distant measures from real radical extremism. These are about social distancing. So what we're doing is trying to really push the boundaries and see how far partisanship goes. We just haven't measured it yet. And so we created this scale that's what we think of as sort of a three-tier scale, where moral disengagement is the first tier. This should be the easiest and most common. The easiest to find and the most common. So this is these are really intense items, but they're not violent. They're not overtly violent. So is the other party a serious threat to the United States and its people? Is the other party downright evil? And are they basically not even human? This is not violence, but it is a precursor to violence. We also created a second tier, which we call Schadenfreude, partisan Schadenfreude, which is not necessarily advocating for violence, but not minding it if something bad or violent happens to outgroup partisans. And so this is, if a politician had died of cancer, would your feelings about that depend on whether it was Republican or Democrat? Do you ever think we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of older partisans in the other party in the public today would just hurry up and die sooner? We had a different wording for this earlier on, and I'll talk about that later. The third tier is what we call political violence or partisan violence. And this is actual approval of violent acts. Is it okay to send threatening messages to the other party's leaders? Is it okay to harass someone on the internet to the point where they feel frightened? How much do you feel it's justified for your party to use violence in advancing your political goals? What if the other party wins in 2020? Then how much do you feel violence would be justified? So we have these three concepts. We're going to focus really on moral disengagement and political violence for now. So basically, this is what we've been finding. We've been collecting a lot of data. These are just data sets that were collected by YouGov. So they should be comparable samples. June 19, September 19, and February 2020 is actually a YouGov panel. So those are the same respondents. What we're seeing is, so if you look at the moral disengagement average levels, around 60 to 70% of American partisans think that the other party is a serious threat to the United States and its people. Between 40 and 50% of American partisans say that the other party is downright evil. And between 20 and 30% is willing to completely dehumanize the partisans on the other side. That's a lot of Americans if we extrapolate from the sample to the larger American population. That would be tens of millions of people. Looking at Schadenfreude, we find the older outgroup partisans should hurry up and die. In fact, we didn't use the older caveat until the June 19th survey. So in 17 and 18, we just said, if large numbers of outgroup partisans died. So there's much lower levels for that, obviously. And then if we talk about elderly people just hurrying up and dying, so a nonviolent death, then there's around almost 30% approval for that. This is, by the way, just to make clear, all before COVID. And the sort of feeling more sad if it's your in-group politician who has cancer, between 10 and 15%. Violence is less common, as we expected. Around 10% of people answer most of the violence questions exactly with anything other than never, which is what we're showing here. There's people who answer anything other than it's never acceptable. About 10% of partisans are saying it's never acceptable to threaten, harass, and to say that violence is an acceptable way to advance political goals. But if you remind people about the 2020 election, that jumps by about 10 points. So now we see 20% of Americans, partisans, thinking that it might be acceptable to use political violence if their party loses the 2020 election. So that's something to keep an eye on. Just looking at this one item, this is from 2018, how much is it justified for your own party to use violence? We wanted to know kind of what are the correlates of this? How can we predict what types of people believe these things? And so what we found was that the strongest predictor by far was an aggressive personality, unrelated to politics, just a trait aggression. People who say, you know, I'm likely to hit someone, I get angry often, sometimes I yell. So that's by far the strongest predictor of people saying it's okay to use violence. But the second strongest predictor is partisanship. So the stronger a person, more strongly a person is identified with their party, the more likely they are to say that it's okay to use violence in advancing political goals. And then third, that moral disengagement concept does create an increased acceptance of political violence, which is what a lot of psychological theories already found about this kind of concept of moral disengagement, that it isn't violence, but it allows violence to occur. Because we have all these just sort of self-report questions, and it's possible there's expressive responding, we tried to do some behavioral experiments. This is in 2019. We told people that there was going to be, we're going to hold these little contests between Democrats and Republicans on response time. And they were going to have multiple competitions. And each time the person who lost, they're going to have headphones on. Each time the person who lost was going to be punished with a noise blast. This is a somewhat common psychological experiment. And we asked them to assign the decibel level of the punishment. For some people, we said assign it for the Democrat and the Republican. For others, we said assign it to either randomly assigned a Democrat or a Republican. It didn't really matter how we asked it. We got similar results. We told them that the 130 jet engine level sound was extremely painful, but not permanently damaging. And what we found was that in-party targets are treated much more gently than out-party targets. So people are much more likely to give their in-party the lowest level of noise. And at the higher, more painful levels of noise, people are more likely to be assigning that level to their partisan outgroup. So we see some behavioral evidence here that there is some actual real world hostility. Again, it's limited, but okay. One thing I want to point out just for right now, because of what's happening now, is that we also had a CCES module in the field in 2018 during the week. I don't know if you remember this. There was 1 week when the pipe bombs were being mailed to Democratic famous people, and there was the tragic shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue. That happened in 1 week. And we happened to have this in the field during that time. So we could do some sort of natural experiment and measure these violent attitudes before and after. And what we found was that before the attacks, we sort of had like a noisy amount of, pretty minimal agreement, as we saw before, with these violent attitudes. In the week of the attack, we seemed to see an increase. And then following the attack, we saw a dramatic increase in people's levels of acceptance of political violence. So the violent attacks increased people's willingness to accept political violence. Now, luckily, it also decayed very quickly because there were not violent events after that. So the decay part is important and good and helpful for us. But that increase is also really, really important for us to keep an eye on, because as we're going through this election cycle, we're likely to see violent events, and it's important to know what's going through people's minds as those events happen. So good news, party leaders can help. They can also harm. So we have a lot of literature that we know about from political science about how leaders can affect people's attitudes. They can affect people's behavior. Leader rhetoric is something that people have done a lot of research into. And so we did some experiments where we had respondents read messages from political leaders. At the time, we chose Trump and Biden, actually, and this is when Biden was not winning the primary, but now we have this evidence. So we have these messages. Some of them were inflaming, so encouraging violence, and some were pacifying, so discouraging violence. I'm not going to show the inflaming results, but they did work. So messages that are pro-violence do tend to increase people's acceptance of partisan violence. But I'll show you the reassuring part. It's possible for leaders to help. And so we ran an experiment. For a randomly selected group of people, they read this, that Joe Biden says violence directed at anyone because of their political opinions is never acceptable, regardless of what those beliefs might be. That's based on a real quote, which is why the Biden and Trump quotes are different. They're actually based on real quotes that they said. Other people randomly were assigned to read that Trump said, "I condemn in the strongest possible terms all acts of violence. That has no place here." And then there was a control condition in which people did not read anything. They just skipped this part completely. So interestingly, what we found is that, so the gray line here is that people in the control condition who have this relationship that we found before, where the stronger their identity is, the more they approve of partisan violence. But after they hear a leader talking about how violence is bad, and this is really important, it doesn't matter which leader it was, people are responding to this, whether it's the in-group or the out-group leader. Their approval of violence declines as they become stronger partisans. So the strongest partisans are the ones who are most likely to reduce their approval of partisan violence when they hear a message that's anti-violence from their leader, presumably because they are strongly committed to the political system and they are following political norms. So this is just these violent attitudes. We wondered whether we actually could get a behavioral effect, and surprisingly, there's some evidence that we could. Again, partisan identity strength generally on the gray line increases. This is the noise blast, people's allocation of very, very loud noises to outgroup partisans. Strongest partisans punish the outgroup the most with very, very loud noises. But if they read the Biden or Trump anti-violence quote before they engaged in that experiment, they assigned lower levels of noise to their outgroup partisans. So the strongest partisans were more merciful than the weaker partisans after hearing these messages from their leaders. And they're pretty, small and quick messages. They're not huge and long, and there's no fireworks. It's just a simple sentence. So in terms of thinking about the future of America, in the most pessimistic case, which we have plenty of reason to think about, what we know from comparative politics is that when we see racial, ethnic, religious, cultural divides fall along partisan lines, it creates a much larger chance of the country falling into civil war. Now, this is not in countries that are exactly like the United States, but it does increase the likelihood of at least seeing violence, right? When our parties can organize our other deep divides, that makes it a lot easier to engage in violence. The last time the American partisan divide fell exactly along racial policy lines, not racial lines, but racial policy lines, because there were no Black voters, that was the beginning of civil war, right? The Civil War was based around these racial policies, and the parties organized that divide so that one party was on one side, the other party was on the other side, and that created space for the nation to fall apart. And then furthermore, the last time that we even had a major legislative attempt to increase racial justice in the 1960s, that period was, I say socially tumultuous, I think as a, that's an understatement. We had assassinations, we had mass protests. And so there's a lot to be worried about. Okay, but think about some optimism, use some optimism here. Among Democrats, and particularly among white Democrats, we are seeing big changes in their racial attitudes. Now, I'm not saying this is going to affect their behavior or, their, activism or anything else, but we are seeing a consistent move among white Democrats towards believing that systemic racism exists and that we should do something about it. That the country needs to continue making changes to give Blacks equal rights with whites. That's 80% of white Democrats in 2017. It was only 50% in 2009. Percent who say the country needs to continue making changes to give Blacks equal rights with whites. In this other breakdown, that's the same thing. Oh, this is just Democrats versus Republicans. Among Democrats, again, these numbers are increasing substantially. For Republicans, they're increasing a little bit, but there's a massive gap, and the gap is increasing. Another way to look at this is this is 2019 data. On a number of racial issues, there's a clear partisan divide in terms of what Democrats believe about giving equal rights to Black and white Americans, whether the legacy of slavery still affects people, that racial discrimination exists and people are not addressing it. These are really big divides. And in fact, I would argue that this is pretty much the central cleavage between the parties right now, is this concept of racial justice. And what that means is that for the first time, this is the optimistic case, for the first time, arguably in US history, the side that says that we need to do something about systemic racism is represented by an entire political party. And it's arguable that that's literally never happened before. That creates a huge amount of power for that argument. And in fact, the radicalism that we're seeing right now may simply be the necessary step of, this is a Julia Azari quote, "the growing pains of a diverse society becoming a full democracy," right? Maybe this is the bumpy part of the road on the way to a better part of the road. However, even if we imagine this, right, we would also imagine that there would be a phenomenal backlash. There should be a massive backlash from white supremacy and patriarchy if we start moving towards social justice. The people who are in charge or people who are at the top of the hierarchy aren't just going to step down quietly. And in particular, thinking back to social identity theory, right? In particular, we should expect to see this backlash happening among the people who benefit the most from traditional social hierarchies. So basically, people who hold very strong white identities, very strong male identities, and whose individual sense of self-worth comes from the status these identities bring them, what Du Bois called the wages of whiteness, this elevated status that comes simply from being white. And in fact, that is the sort of area where we expect to see the sort of largest clashes in politics. And additionally, we should just sort of keep in mind as we go through this election that there's a lot of race in what we're seeing in terms of our partisan divide. Our parties have really organized us at this point around the issue of racial justice. And the fights that we're seeing on the streets can be organized by party. And therefore, these are very powerful forces on both sides who are arguing about this. And it may cause people who feel threatened, that their status is threatened, to be willing to maybe break the rules or to engage in unconventional or dangerous political behavior. So the final question is just simply, is this the type of radical change that democracy in America can survive, understanding that the country's built on a sort of on the institution of racism and slavery and ongoing racial discrimination. Is that a possible America? And so that is really what we're living through right now. I think it's important to think of it that way, but also to understand that there are a lot of people who are willing to engage in violence and partisan violence, and really just listening and waiting to hear what their leaders have to say about it. So I'm going to leave that there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Lily. That was terrific. You covered a lot of ground there, even though you had sort of a pessimistic conclusion, I think, at the end. But I have lots of questions. Several people ask about the relationship between ideology and policy polarization on the one hand, and the effective polarization, which you talk about, and how you see that relationship. Are these, does ideological polarization lead to affective polarization, or are they independent, do you think? So
they're definitely related. In my earlier work, I definitely found that as, actually issue-based polarization did increase somewhat as sorting increased when I manipulated it experimentally. Actually not experimentally, it was a matching, but so there's certainly a link between policy-based polarization and affective polarization. I don't think we yet know the causal direction. But I would also point out that it really depends on the issue itself, on the policy itself. And what we're seeing is that policies that are really based in identity, like immigration or anything that's racialized, including welfare, which healthcare has become racialized now, gun ownership has become racialized. So anything that really taps into a distinct, deep identity is a policy that people will fight for and will become more extreme on as their party leads them in that direction.
And we're seeing that a lot in the campaign right now. So how worried should we be about violence?
I think pretty worried. So there's a lot of unknowns, obviously. We are currently seeing a party that is excusing a person who just murdered two people in an argument about social justice and racial justice. And that's, I think, disturbing to see that we have now, there's a partisan divide over whether it's okay to kill people who are protesting. And we're certainly going to see more protests. The outcome of the election is going to be almost certainly uncertain for a while, which will create a large opportunity for a lot of chaos and a lot of protesting. And as you get more people on the streets, there's more opportunities for groups to clash. We've seen now recently in some cities, militias coming to counter Black Lives Matter protests. So there's that type of violence that I think I'm worried about. There's also sort of electoral intimidation type violence that may occur. Trump has certainly been telegraphing that he may engage in that, sending troops to places that are close the swing states. So I'm quite worried about it. I don't think things are going to get better right for the foreseeable future. I think that it's going to get worse before it gets better at this point.
Oh, okay. So I have a question from Sue Lonnie Matson, who asks, she noticed that that higher income people continue to be more Republican than Democrat, but less so than they used to be. And union members continue to be more Democrat than Republican, but less so than they used to be. And she wonders if that means these groups are less important to their parties.
So they're very different. They're very different groups. The union members are part of the difference is that union members are just disappearing, right? We have fewer unions. So between 1972 and 2016, the number of union members dropped dramatically. I don't think that they're less important to the parties. What's happening with income is that there is a brand new thing happening. It used to be that education and income both predicted Republican identification because education and income are correlated. And in 2016, for the first time, we actually saw that education predicted being a Democratic identity and high income predicted Republican identity. So these correlated variables were moving in two different partisan directions. So I think it's not necessarily that they're less important to the party, but there may be some sort of realignment going on. For the union members, I think it's partially that there just aren't enough of them anymore, and also that a lot of union members actually like Trump and voted for him in 2016.
I have another question from Jim Casterlang, who asks, is there any historical evidence that there's been major social change take place without some violence?
So I'm not a historian. I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. I would love to hear it if other people can think of any example of that. I do think that power doesn't give itself up. You know, the way that social change happens is almost by definition disruptive, because it's changing the hierarchy, the sort of status hierarchy of the society, and no one wants to lose status, right? We saw even in these tiny little marginal groups, nobody wants to lose status. So people fight for status, and the only way to take it, or not even reduce it, but to equalize it with people who used to be lower status, that's a threat to status. And so I think that there has to be a disruption of some kind in order for there to be any kind of change in social hierarchy.
Yeah, I don't know if you've come across Joanne Friedman's book, the Yale historian. Her recent book, I think it's called Field of Blood, where she talks a lot about up through the Civil War period in the United States, political violence was quite common, and in fact was the norm in many cases. And of course, there's been other periods in our history where we've had a lot of political violence around the original populist period in the late 19th century. And then, of course, as recently as the 1960s, had a lot of political violence, assassination of 3 major political leaders, riots on campuses. I wonder if you see the political violence today and the type of radical partisanship today as different from these earlier periods in any way.
So I do think it's similar in terms of the unrest that we're seeing. The difference is that the parties have aligned. So in the 1960s, there were white supremacists in both parties. There were conservative Southern Democrats who did not want racial justice. And there were also white Republicans who did not want racial justice. And so there was a battle over legislation to overturn Jim Crow, which ultimately succeeded, but it also broke the parties. It broke the Democratic Party and started the process of a realignment that is only really ended in the 1990s, which I think is the impetus for this idea of sorting. And all these identities come into alignment as the people who kind of didn't fit in the Democratic Party as a pro-civil rights party gradually left it over decades, because partisanship is a strong identity. And so it took, a generation for that shift to occur. But we now have a Republican Party that is the white man's party. And that was something, there's a lot of articles about kind of concern among the Republican Party in the 60s and 70s about becoming the white man's party, and thinking that wouldn't be a good idea during the Nixon era, for instance. But effectively, that's what's happened now. And so we have one party that is really defending kind of white patriarchy, and another party that's fighting that's fighting against white patriarchy. So the difference is that the parties are organizing this debate now, and they weren't in the 1960s.
Right. So Andrew Zach, who's a student at WSU, asks a question about the relationship between education and resorts to violence or extreme partisanship. Is there any relationship there?
Yeah, actually, I was just writing this chapter in the book. There's a slight negative relationship between education and acceptance of violence. So people who are more highly educated tend to accept violence less. That effect, though, is much larger among Republicans because it's a cross-cutting identity effectively for Republicans. So for highly educated Republicans, that high education that's normally associated with Democrats cross-pressures them, and so they become less extreme. Among Democrats, the effect of education is still there, but it's not as big because it's not a cross-pressure.
Right. So another question off our YouTube chat, and they asked about how should we think about violence perpetrated by individuals to try to delegitimize the other side? So what they had in mind, for instance, is there were apparently some people who engaged in violent acts during the Black Lives Matter protests, but they were not part of the Black Lives Matters movement. They were opposed to it, and so they did it in order to delegitimize the movement. How should we think about that kind of violence?
Yeah, that's the traditional outside agitator, kind of provocation that we tend not to think, that modern American politics has, but it certainly does, and we're seeing it happen. As that one kind of natural experiment that we accidentally conducted in 2018 shows, it will be effective at increasing violence, right? Violence begets violence, and so if we have people who are engaging in violence, it will affect attitudes. People will approve of violence more. Now, like I said before, there is that quick decay, so that approval disappears pretty quickly. But if we have, sustained levels of violence, then that could create a kind of shift of norms.
Okay, I have a question from Tim Chatburn, who's a PhD student actually at WSU. And he says, the focus of your work has been on religion, ideology, and race. I'm wondering if these identities lead to partisanship, or if partisanship leads to a stronger connection with overlapping identities, driving both social and political polarization.
That's a good question. So our traditional understanding of partisanship is that other identities inform it, right? So our race and our religion and our ideology inform our partisanship. They tell us which party to join. Now, there's work by Michelle Margolis that's actually found the reverse with religion, depending on what part of your life cycle, lifespan you're in. It's fantastic work. I recommend reading it. The thing that informs the way I think about it is really that the civil rights legislation of the 1960s really was an impetus for a lot of this sorting. And so it's sort of like there was this racial policy that occurred. It was aligned with one party, and that therefore people learned which party they were supposed to be in. That kind of racial messaging was reinforced with decades of either implicit or explicit campaign information or cable news coverage or internet social media interactions. So I think there's somewhat of a reciprocal relationship where you learn which party you're supposed to be in with racial cues and religious cues, but also the parties can court racial and religious groups in order to strengthen their party. And so I think that there's sort of a reciprocal relationship.
Mm-hmm. So another question from YouTube, and that is, how do you control for how different partisans use or understand language differently? For example, the idea of systemic racism is a phrase that has little meaning on the red side of the partisan divide, but is commonly used on the blue side of the partisan divide. does it matter in terms of the language you're using in your survey instruments, how different partisans might understand that language?
Oh, for the survey instruments. Yeah, so we don't talk about social justice or racial justice in the surveys. And I mean, it's a great question. Right? Social justice is a bad word on the right, and it's considered a virtue on the left. So the way that we talk about our results, we form it in those types of phrasing because it's convenient. But the way that we measure these attitudes is much more along the lines of traditional racial resentment scales, identification with racial groups, strength of identification with groups, and sort of how those groups interact empirically. Once we have all these different pieces of knowledge about the individual, we can look at how those different parts of their identity interact without them really knowing that we're looking at it exactly that way.
Okay. So maybe we can try to end on a little more optimistic note. If we were inclined to reduce the level of polarization in our country, how would we go about doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, first I'll just say the thing that I said at the end, which is it's possible that this polarization is good and necessary, right? In order to have a more just society, it's possible that this is actually the thing that leads us to a place of a more fair and representative democracy. And that in fact, lack of polarization in the past has actually come out of really, a bunch of white powerful people deciding to leave out Black people and agreeing. So the fact that we're polarized, and specifically along these racial lines, gives more power to the idea of racial equality. But it's also extremely damaging, and it stops all legislation. It prevents us from doing things when we could have space to do them. We're politicizing things that don't need to be politicized. So the only answer to that is really exposure to outgroup partisans in a sympathetic and non-political way. There's nothing else that I can think of where people could begin to humanize one another again, because this is the problem, is that we've got 50% of the country who's literally calling the other party animals, that they behave like animals. They shouldn't be treated like humans. And you can't reason through that. If you could, then all those issue positions that people have in common would work. So we can't reason through something like dehumanization. We have to rehumanize each other, which means showing us the good sides of actual human beings and understanding where they're coming from. And that, I know I'm not suggesting that we find the good sides of, actual Nazis. That's not something that is going to be productive. We also have to understand and agree on the humanity of all of us, the common humanity of all of us. But that humanizing, I think, across the board for all Americans is a really crucial step. And as far as we could have more contact, or more sympathetic contact, or more non-political contact, that humanization, I think, could occur.
I wonder what you think about, some of our future events are going to look at the role of social media, the role of media in general in covering our elections. I wonder what you think about their role, or the role of political elites in terms of stoking the division and stoking this sense of grievance about our identities. Can something be done there to lessen the divisions?
Yeah, so social media certainly has allowed us to kind of bask in our exclusive identities. It's not as much of a echo chamber as I think a lot of people believe, but it does connect us to people who, for instance, believe crazy things, right? So it allows insane ideas to be considered right next to extremely well reported investigative journalism. That is, I think, one issue. There's a lot of problems right now with sort of conspiracy theorizing and what is true at a base level that that social media allows to happen, I think. As far as political elites, yeah, they have a lot to, they have a lot of responsibility for this. The language that political elites use to describe each other is the type of language that if you use it to describe another racial group, you would be kicked out of whatever job you have, right? I mean, it's partisanship is the last prejudice that we're allowed to say in public, and our partisan leaders do it. They use terrible language to describe each other, and that's something that really came out of the Gingrich era. There was a GOPAC memo that came out in 1994, basically saying like you should use the word poisonous and like demon to talk about the other side. So yeah, the language is really important, as we saw from our experiment. You can make people hate the other side just by having elite rhetoric, encouraging them to do so. But you can also make people be more compassionate and less violent by using kinder language. So it's up to them to change the way they speak.
Okay. I'll just say that, the author of that memo, that Gingrich memo, was Frank Lutz, who I went to graduate school with. So I remember him from back in the good old days. In any case, this has been a terrific conversation. It has been the perfect start for our series on the 2020 election. I want to thank you very much, Lilliana, for joining us today. Let me also remind you that our series will continue next week on Wednesday at noon. We have Joseph Lowndes from the University of Oregon. He's going to be talking about populism, nationalism, and race next week. So I encourage you to join us then. And now, once again, I want to thank Lilliana Mason for a really stimulating and interesting conversation about partisanship and partisan polarization.
Thank you so much.